Hello and welcome to the Postmodern Prometheus, a new podcast dedicated to all things Frankenstein. My name is Nancy.
And I'm Asha.
And in the previous episode, we discussed the framing device with Robert Walton in the 1818 version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
And now to delve into the plot.
Yes.
Well, not really. We don't actually get to the plot till chapter 7 or so. But now we're going to talk about Victor's childhood.
Yay, or as we call this, Frankenstein, the childhood years. Okay, so this is framed as Victor giving his story to Robert Walton. And he obviously starts where every story begins, in childhood. Yay!
Yeah, it starts before where every good story begins, about 20 years before the story starts.
So basically Victor says he was born in Geneva to a very wealthy family. He introduces the people in his family, his mom, his dad, his brothers, his sister / cousin /
Slash lover. Well, to be lover.
Yeah.
And his true lover, Henry.
His best friend forever.
Henry Clavel.
Yep. And then he kind of gives like the highlights of his childhood years and sort of foreshadows where he's gonna go with his story.
I mean, he's telling this story as a kind of to explain sort of why things happen or why he does things. Or even I think even in the text he's sort of like, sorry to dwell on these times, it's just, gosh dang it, they were good times before my life went to shit.
Yeah, he really, like, all throughout this section, I think his tone is very nostalgic. And he tends to paint everything in a very rosy light. I mean, it's also just kind of an info dump.
It is definitely an info dump that would not pass, like, modern literary standards.
Yeah.
But, like, you know, when something's written 200 years ago, it gets a pass.
And I think there's some really interesting things to discuss here. So, should we just start with Victor's dad, his father?
Papa Frankenstein.
Papa Frankenstein. So basically his father is a wealthy Genevan and
he came from a long line of councillors and syndics, and his father filled several public situations with honour and reputation. Whatever that means.
So I assume his father is sort of a public official of some kind. So I've got here that syndics means Genevan legislators. So they probably are some sort of lawmakers or involved in the government somehow. I think it's important to think about his father as sort of this bastion of good society in a way. And then sort of contrast that with where Frankenstein decides to go, because I think maybe you think of his childhood as sort of instilling the motivations which eventually lead him to kind of create life, and you know, making laws and being a public official is sort of related to that, so you can kind of see a link maybe.
And he was very committed to his work throughout his younger years and did not consider marriage until he was an older gentleman. And that's where Caroline, Mama Frankenstein, comes into it. Do you want to regale the tale of Caroline, Nancy?
Well, I mean... No, I don't. So Caroline is the daughter of Papa Frankenstein's best friend, essentially, who falls into poverty, and then Frankenstein elder kind of seeks both of them out, and then he acts as Caroline's protector. I think that's really interesting in that sort of relationship of the man being sort of Caroline's rescuer in a way. I think that's how Victor also sees himself in a way, except that what he's rescuing is kind of humanity. And he expects that humanity will kind of bestow him with the same sort of love and affection that Caroline gives his father, Frankenstein's father.
Like thankfulness.
Yeah.
What's the better word for thankfulness?
Gratefulness.
Gratitude.
Yes.
Yeah, like
That's the word.
you know, this boundless gratitude. Because you don't really get any information about their courting years or anything. It's literally just in 2 sentences. He came like a protecting spirit to the poor girl who committed herself to his care, and after the interment of his friend, he conducted her to Geneva and placed her under the protection of a relation. 2 years after this event, Caroline became his wife.
Yeah.
So I mean, at least there was time between.
And it's also interesting that he meets her whilst she knelt by Beaufort's coffin, weeping bitterly. So, yeah, so you see the love and the sense of gratitude, like you were saying, kind of born out of a death and of grief. So, I don't know, maybe that's foreshadowing, or maybe that's just very romantic somehow.
Well, yeah, because there's a little preamble up to this bit. It talks about how Beaufort, Mama Frankenstein's father and Papa Frankenstein's BFF, as he was sort of dying from depression and shame, I'm assuming, she was supporting them by like doing like plain work. She was like plaiting straw and various other means of earning a pittance. And so, you know, he finds this like beautiful creature like trapped in poverty, and that's just sort of how it is in a way. But in the 1931 rewrite,
You mean 1831?
Wow, she lived a long life. She went a long time to edit, didn't she? 1831. In the 1831 rewrite, I think Caroline as a character, particularly as this tragic figure in poverty, is really emphasised, I think, because I remember it being a lot stronger when I read that version a few years ago. Mm-hmm. Particularly later on in the novel, when Victor goes back home, he describes looking at a painting of his mother that his father had commissioned, and it was of her when she was in her poverty. And for some reason, I had this striking remembrance when reading the 1831 that she was actually holding a piece of like plaited straw in that painting, but in this adaptation, in the original, not adaptation, the original 1818 text, that's not there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like when Mary Shelley was rewriting the text, she picked up on themes that maybe to an extent she was not super aware of when she was writing it the first time. She was very young after all. And so when she was rewriting it, she really hammers you over the head with things that were kind of clear enough in the first edition. And I think you really get that with Caroline's character, and you really get that with Elizabeth's character. Which leads us to
Elizabeth's character. Yes. So I think this is actually a point of most difference. Is that even a phrase? It's a point of very noticeable.
I think point of difference, noticeable change.
Yeah, it's a very noticeable change here that Elizabeth is actually the daughter of Papa Frankenstein's sister. And in the 1831 edition, she's not actually blood related to Victor's family.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure in the rewrite, she was like a little this vagrant on the street who was just very beautiful compared to all the other vagrant children. And Caroline, Mama Frankenstein, sort of looks at her and is like, I must have that child.
Yeah, I
and
think
sort of just adopts her off the street.
Yeah, so I think they adopt her from like a poor couple who had also adopted her from some sort of noble person, and Elizabeth's actually kind of noble blood, but her family fell into poverty or something like that.
Yeah, it was something like that, but she was just like beautiful golden haired cherub like on the street. And I think they were there because Caroline would take the children to poorer neighborhoods to like remind them of her humble beginnings, and like yeah, the morals of things are really like hammered over the head where they kind of didn't need to be, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that in both editions you kind of have Elizabeth, her goodness is kind of inborn no matter what. So in one she's kind of the cousin of Frankenstein, and she has her goodness from her mother, who's Victor's aunt and who dies. And then
Women. Do they just die?
yeah. But in this other one, you also have her goodness somehow inborn into her being, and it kind of somehow like overcomes all her circumstances, and she's some sort of miraculous child who's rescued, somehow more deserving than the other children who are also in poverty. So it's quite questionable from like a, I don't know, like a contemporary morality stand of view.
I think it's like linking back to the overall thing of like people valuing beauty, which thus far I think is probably just a much stronger theme in the rewrite than here. And I think that's why she probably changes the story a bit to make Elizabeth maybe more of a symbol than she was originally, which, you know, for better or worse. But it's interesting that the reason she goes to live with Victor's family is that her mother dies, I'm presuming, in childbirth, and her father wants to marry an Italian woman, and so he writes to Papa Frankenstein, says like, would you like to take her on as your own charge? Her mother's dowry is secured to her, like, you know, I think the implication, like, yeah, she either goes to you or she goes to another family. Would you like her? Which I think is super interesting because there's like this weird evil stepmother aspect to that. Because it's like, why can't you keep your infant daughter? Why does you marrying another woman mean you have to give up the first child? And then I remember, like, I think there's like this. It could just be plot contrivance to like forward things along. But I wonder if, because I think there's something about Mary Shelley having a troubled relationship with her own stepmother in real life.
Yes, I think that's true.
I think that's true. Maybe that's coming from there, or maybe it's just a contrivance. But like, I sort of remembered that and thought that was an interesting point.
Well, I think it's also a very interesting point that Elizabeth's connection is kind of entirely with the maternal figures in her life, with her mom who dies, and then with her replacement mother, Caroline.
Also die. And they both die for her too, but we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah. So
she's an angel of death.
Right, but there's a very sort of sacrificial sort of aspect of both Caroline and Elizabeth right from the beginning. Like, they are both sort of made to be sort of these sacrificial, self-sacrificing figures. And like you said, maybe that's sort of foreshadowing Victor's relationship with women as the story goes on.
Expects of them too, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think he's very expectant of Elizabeth to just wait around to be his bride. And yeah, we find out, we're gonna like properly start getting through the plot of the childhood years in a second. This is chaotic. But you know, from the first time she's brought into the family, Caroline, Mama Frankenstein, has it in her head of like, oh, they're gonna be married. And that's kind of just the fact of it for like the rest of the story, and on her deathbed she sort of says like it's, you know, kind of her dying wish. I really wanted to see you guys together. Make it happen. Please. And so, and you never get, I mean, you only get the story from Victor's perspective, but you never see him like wrestle with this, or like it's kind of just a fact, but he also doesn't desire her in a romantic way. I think he genuinely adores her, even if he doesn't see her for her fully realized self. He still adores her as, you know, as a sister, as a friend.
Yeah, I think
But,
it's very
yeah.
remarkable the way that Victor kind of, in his childhood, he never actually has a sort of moment of sexual awakening or sort of romantic awakening that you kind of normally expect out of people's narratives of their life, I guess.
Yeah, and it's something that's inserted into most adaptations that are trying to have fidelity to the text. They will really amp up the romantic relationship, which is kind of it's done to give Elizabeth more of a character. I'll give them that, but it kind of undermines the kind of interesting aspect of their relationship, and that's just this weird kind of incestual aspect of this family, that the dad was kind of like the guiding spirit, the saving savior spirit of the mother in the weird paternal way, and then they get married and they've got these like two kids that are cousins raised as brother and sister, and they're just expected to get married. And it's, you know, he reiterates that they had a very sort of isolated, sort of tight-knit family.
Yep.
And so it's just this weird incestuous bundle of humans.
Right, and in this version, it's actual incest as well, like, because they're related. I mean, granted, it
I
wasn't...
think it was okay.
Yeah, it was okay, but it's interesting that even though it was okay, Mary Shelley still felt the need to kind of change it. But I think what you were saying about the idea of it being protective, it seems almost like Victor's just... his future marriage to Elizabeth is just an extension of that protection. It's really not, like, I never get a sense that he feels passionate about Elizabeth. He
No.
he loves her.
He loves her tenderly. Which is a very overused word in this text. He loved her tenderly. They had a tenderness.
Right. And that's not like passionate love in any way.
That's just affection.
No. And I think Victor's passion is actually just reserved for science and his sort of intellectual pursuits in his kind of childhood years.
Fine.
Which is fine, yeah. That's fine. Yep.
But anyway, getting back into Elizabeth's characterization. We keep going on tangents. No more tangents. But yeah, Elizabeth is described in, I don't know, these weird, not quite bipolar, but very, you know, he describes her, I think, as he authentically remembers her, and then justifies it because maybe it doesn't seem quite the ideal, and he's trying to describe her as an ideal because he's trying to remember her as an angel. And I'll give a demonstration. I can probably just read this whole paragraph, they're full of them. From this time, Elizabeth Lavenza became my playfellow, and as we grew older, my friend. She was docile and good-tempered, yet gay and playful as a summer insect. Although she was lively and animated, her feelings were strong and deep, and her disposition uncommonly affectionate. No one could better enjoy liberty, yet no one could submit with more grace than she did to constraint and caprice. Thank you. Her imagination was luxuriant, yet her capability of application was great. Her person was the image of her mind. Her hazel eyes, although lively as a bird's, possessed an attractive softness. Her figure was light and airy, and though she was capable of enduring great fatigue, she appeared the most fragile creature in the world. So I don't know, it's very, he describes her as being this quite this lively, but also appearing very delicate. It's almost like you get this image, this idea that she was this very sort of like almost like wild child, like running through the flowers, sort of still very idealized, but a bit maybe not quite a different kind of idealized to maybe how he wants to depict her to Walton.
Well, to what extent do you think it's kind of his inability almost to see her as a full person? Like, you get the sense that he understands parts of her character that are there, like her, you know, her...
Like, he almost can't understand how she can sort of look so fragile and be so calm, but also be so, like, wild and free.
Right, but there's also a like kind of underlying sense that she's actually very smart. She's extremely like self-sufficient. She can, you know, she's very capable as a person. But you kind of get the sense that Victor doesn't quite see that in and of themselves. Like, he only sees those qualities in relation to her role as, you know, his future wife and as
Current
a girl and a sister and a mother. He kind of can't quite give her those same praises that he eventually gives Clavel in a way, even though I think their personalities would seem to be quite similar.
They're the same person.
Yeah.
They should get married.
Well, that's your theory. So
They would have been so happy together.
I think they would have, you know, been better off without Victor for sure.
Those years without him must have been so nice.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting that they're sort of like, Victor, please write, but no one ever like makes the journey to like come and see him to make sure he's okay after not hearing from him. Like, Henry turns up, but that's because he wants to study. He's like, oh, so I was in the neighborhood.
Yeah, like, you question, you know, did they miss him that much? I wouldn't have missed Victor. But that's
I think
me.
they love him, but he's probably... Oh, look, they probably didn't mind him because he was such a studious little nerd that he was probably just, like, always, like, studying as they were just, like, running around playing.
Right, so they just didn't notice he was gone, really. They were like, oh, we thought you were just in your study all this time. You went away? What?
You've been at university for 6 years? We just thought you found a good book.
Shall we move on to Victor's two very important siblings?
Oh, wait, his love or his brothers?
His brothers. His
Okay.
siblings. His sibs.
The Sibs.
The sibs.
What to say about the Sibs? Well, there's Ernest.
The best character.
There's the character who I care about.
And then there's the character that readers are supposed to care about.
Well, I don't think they're necessarily... Look, William's more of a symbol.
Yeah, so...
He's just a child.
So my question is William the Tiny Tim of Frankenstein?
I don't think so, because Tiny Tim was supposed to inspire hope. William just sort of exists to die.
Well, but...
Tiny Tim exists to die and make someone feel bad. And then
Tiny
not
Tim
be dead
doesn't
and make
die.
people feel...
I mean, he
In
only...
the one
he
version.
dies
in the alternate universe he does.
Okay, fine. Look, I hate to be the person who hates Tiny Tim, but I do hate Tiny Tim because he is awful. He's just so...
Okay, it's fair to hate Tiny Tim. I also don't think William is Tiny Tim.
Okay.
William is given much less screen time too. He just kind of is a child that exists and then doesn't.
Right. I mean, William has zero personality and he's pretty much just like...
Well, he doesn't have zero personality. He's just
brother.
a child.
Children can have personalities.
Not in this book.
But the real, you know, hero of the book is Ernest.
He's the one that survives, I think.
So basically, the other siblings are a little bit disparaging about Ernest. They're like, he's too sickly to have application.
Yeah.
But you get the sense that Ernest is just really stupid and they want to be nice. And they're like, Ernest should just be a farmer. Yep, that's Ernest. He's a farmer.
Ernest.
He can't be a lawyer or a scientist like the other siblings. He just has to be a farmer.
He had been afflicted with ill health from his infancy, through which Elizabeth I had been his constant nurses. His disposition was gentle, and he was incapable of severe application. Yeah, there we go. It's a really just kind of like, I don't know why that was written in there. Because, spoilers, Ernest does nothing. He doesn't even do the bare minimum and get killed.
He doesn't even get William's role of just dying, yeah.
Yeah, and I really, don't understand why he doesn't die or at least, noticeably survive. Because Victor and Mary Shelley both seem, and the creature for that matter, all seem to just not realise he exists halfway through the novel. The creature's just like, well, I've killed all his loved ones. And Victor's like, all my loved ones are dead.
You kind of get the sense that Ernest is just that character that escaped the editing process somehow. Like, he was supposed to get cut, but then just never did.
But then she rewrote the novel and his role remains the same. I don't think anything about him is edited.
See, he's not even noticeable enough to be edited.
I notice him.
Hey, I have a theory that Ernest is actually just Walton, and...
Look, it's not the worst concept to come out of Frankenstein, but it's close.
Hey, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Maybe you should make a film adaptation where they're played by the same actor and you can all be just like, well, that's up to the reader's interpretation.
Well, because Ernest really wants to get Victor's attention, so he figures the only way he can possibly do that.
Where are you getting that from, Nancy? Because is it in the text? Because you know what isn't in the text? Ernest!
Look, he does a lot in the background. Who knows what he's doing in the background? Maybe Papa Frankenstein was like to Ernest, you can't be a sailor, and then he decided to go be a sailor.
Then who's the sister he's writing to?
Oh, maybe Elizabeth survived. What?
It's like the whole Romeo and Juliet poison bottle that's not really poison thing.
Oh my god. Oh my gosh, maybe Ernest is actually Walton and then this whole thing is a dream. Victor just falls asleep at his desk and he dreams this whole thing.
Wouldn't it be Ernest's dream? And then he sort of wakes up and he's like, and then all his family are around him and it's rosy coloured vision. And it's just oh, Ma, Pa, Victor, Lizzie, Willie, Justine, you're all alive. You're all here. I had the most horrible dream and you're all there, but then you're all dead. And then the creature pops his head through the window. Oh, you're all right there. He's like, and you're here too.
And they're actually just best friends.
But I thought, no, Ernest, me and my creation are buddies.
Yes, that is the story I want.
I'm so happy to be here, and now I'm never going home. I'm never leaving home again. Somewhere over the rainbow, instrumental plays in the background.
I think this is the alternate universe that we need.
All right, let's write that movie. Anyhow, I think we've gotten through enough of Ernest. Let's get to Clavel, the love story of the book.
It's definitely a bromance.
I think Clavel is kind of for me and Nancy, probably the best character in the novel because as we've grown up, our life applications probably align to him most. Because
We're just waiting for the part where we get killed for some reason.
Pretty much. So yeah, it talks. He's very into like literature and like the romance and chivalry, and there's a really cute thing here where Victor says, "I remember when he was 9 years old, he wrote a fairy tale which was the delight and amazement of all his companions. His favourite study consisted in books of chivalry and romance, and when very young, I can remember we used to act plays composed by him out of these favourite books, the principal characters of which were Orlando, Robin Hood, Amadeus, and St. George."
Would you say Amadeus?
What is it? Amadeus. Amadeus was... I knew that was wrong.
I mean...
Anyhow, which I think that's really cute, because it does something that Victor kind of doesn't do for the rest of his reminiscing, which was give a very specific sort of account of a sweet thing that happened in childhood. Like, he mentions specific events when it's related to the plot, certainly, which we'll talk about in a second. But this is, I don't know, it's a very sweet edition where he's talking about a specific anecdote of his childhood where, you know, they used to play act things, whereas when he was talking about Elizabeth, it was just like a series of adjectives and verbs.
And kind of contradictory
nouns.
ones, yeah.
Yeah, but it was just kind of like, just like a series of adjectives that were basically like, yeah, she was very like lively but sweet.
Yeah.
See, I just summarized two
right.
paragraphs in one sentence.
I think you're right that this is kind of like the only time Victor sort of shows us proof of the kind of relationship he had with his friends and his family. Like, in all the other ones, he kind of just says, oh yeah, this was the case. Like, we all loved each other. Everyone got along great.
We never quarreled.
Yeah, but in this case,
Not once.
he actually gives us an idea of what he did, of what they did. And I think it's interesting that it focuses on kind of telling stories or living this sort of romantic play acting sort of thing.
Particularly, I think it's nice because, you know, that's not Victor's area of interest. So it's a point where, you know, he's doing something that is his friend's interest.
Well, I think...
And I think that sort of signifies Henry's importance to him.
Right.
And it's
I
like
think
quite
you
sweet.
can read it like that, but alternately, I think you can also see it as sort of an extension of what he's interested in as well, because both of these interests are kind of to do with fabrication in a way. Like, the texts that he's interested in are also sort of like earlier medieval, but also kind of has that sort of medieval mindset. And I find that really interesting that both of these characters are surrounded by these much older sort of texts and by the older how would you say, like, ideas?
Yeah, well, it kind of emphasizes this kind of secluded upbringing they had where they kind of weren't connected to maybe the politics or the scientific development of the wider world.
Yeah.
And, you know, Victor doesn't really discover that until he leaves home.
Right.
And, you know, it is a significant aspect of his story because, and, you know, he does blatantly draw attention to that if we want to maybe now go into the events of his youth that he specifically mentions as things that inspired him.
Yeah.
And I think the first being the books. Did you want to go into that now?
Yeah, so he mentions a few texts that he's particularly interested in, and these are the texts of Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus. So all of these three are kind of early medieval texts, and I don't know, like, maybe I need to investigate this further. I really like medieval literature, so...
Nancy does. She wrote a thesis on it.
So I want to kind of research this more, because I don't think I've ever come across any sort of texts, sort of critical analyses of Frankenstein, which actually delve into the medieval links, you know? And I think they seem to be quite important in shaping his thinking. And also, as we covered earlier, Clavel's thinking, which I never thought about before.
Yeah, that is an interesting point, I think. That, yeah, they
To be researched.
TBD. TBR. Yeah, and I think, but the sort of blatant significance of him sort of discovering these texts is he finds them really interesting because, of course, they're kind of alchemists, so they're talking about these like grand things like the philosopher's stone and all of that stuff. And Victor, at being like quite young at the time, 13 years of age? Let's just say 13. So he's being like quite young, and also as he's told us, he was self-educated, so he kind of just has been choosing what to study, which, by modern standards is the like, I don't know the word for it, but where you don't send kids to school and they just choose what to study and then they become horrible people. Anyhow, I guess what I'm trying to get through this is that he probably has he's a very limited awareness of science in this way. So he's sort of reading this and taking it as text. Mm-hmm. Because, he hasn't had anyone of scientific value tutoring him in, like, just the basics of like, the science of the time. So he takes this all as fact and he goes to his dad and he's like, "Dad, look at this." And the dad looks at the books and he's just like, "Don't waste your time on that." But, like, doesn't sort of explain why. And then Victor goes into this weird, like, rant of, like, if only my father had explained why not to bother with them, I might not have bothered with them, but because he didn't, I kept studying them, and that is what has led to my inevitable doom. And I'm just like, stop blaming your dad for your problems. He was good to you.
I think you kind of see there, Victor does really tend to sort of, he doesn't have a lot of awareness. Like, he kind of just wants to blame events or other people or these things that happened in his life. And
I feel like in the 31 version, or maybe it was just how, like, we studied it or were taught it in our lit class, but there was a greater sense that he was kind of blaming his privileged youth for, like, his downfall, because he was like, "Oh, my parents just treated me so well." And, like, they just didn't give me a good sense of humility, and that's kind of what led me to my downfall. And it's a bit like, look, there is an argument there, but you shouldn't be the one to make it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, Mary Shelley's father and mother were both very interested in kind of what is the correct upbringing of children, like what should they be taught. And you kind of don't know whether Victor is like a good example or a bad example. Is Victor as a character like supposed to be a sort of evangelist for these sort of free thinking ways of tutoring your children? Because, he didn't turn out very good.
Yeah. I mean, he sort of argues that it was a good way of raising them because then they sort of pursued their interests not because they felt they had to, but because they wanted to and, like, sort of impress their parents.
For some reason, I always think of this quote from Pride and Prejudice when I read this part, which is like, I think when Darcy says something like, "I was given good morals but left to follow them like with pride or arrogance," or something like that. But basically, like, you're given the good sort of starting point, but then you kind of just meander away from that because you're not given any guidance.
Yeah.
That's what it just makes me think of for some reason. Sorry.
Yeah.
Tangent.
Well, as we are. Anyway, so Victor, like, keeps reading these types of works and just taking it as gospel and like wants to pursue it and is really interested. And I think he talks about at one point the idea of like raising the dead and raising spirits. And this is before he kind of understands the concept of death, like in a meaningful way. So these are all still very like innocent fancies. And this then leads up to the second sort of significant event that happens where I think him and his family are like, they're off at their holiday home or something. Where was it?
When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Belle Rive when we witnessed a most violent and terrible thunderstorm. It advanced from behind the mountains of Jura, and the thunder burst at once with frightful loudness from various quarters of the heavens. I remained, while the storm lasted, watching its progress with curiosity and delight. As I stood at the door, on a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak, which stood about 20 yards from our house, and so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared and nothing remained but a blasted stump. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, the catastrophe of this tree excited my extreme astonishment, and I eagerly inquired of my father the nature and origin of thunder and lightning. He replied, electricity, describing at the same time the various effects of that power. He constructed a small electrical machine and exhibited a few experiments. He also made a kite with a wire and string which drew down that fluid from the clouds.
This is an interesting point from the novel because it's something that emerges in a lot of adaptations, just the idea of electricity and electricity's place in the story.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, I think, building off the old Hollywood film, it becomes a part of the creation, which in the novel might be, might not be, it's not described. Because I think this scene, as it was in the novel, was not this spark of like, oh, what can electricity do and how can it? I mean, it is that, but it's not. The significance of it is not that this is what he then uses to create life later on. It's more he beholds this like demonstration of like nature's real power and all that, and he realizes these like writers he's been following, their ideas seem very like outlandish and unattainable, or his understanding of electricity kind of defuncts them in his mind, and so that's what sort of makes him put those away and want to pursue science. So
more modern science.
Yeah, modern science.
For that time.
For the time, yeah. So, yeah, I think it's interesting because, yeah, the electricity thing, it then is transferred in the old Hollywood film to, like, how he brings the creature to life. And that's constantly how it's done in adaptations. Even in ones where it is a more faithful text, they will keep this scene in, but it's not in the same way. It's not quite in the same way it is in the text, because it becomes more of a foreshadowing thing than really a point of really the spark of like interest in science, which is really all it is in the novel. That's really all it is. It's kind of, you could almost take it out in a way and replace it with something else.
I think it's more than just his becoming interested in science through lightning and electricity. Like, I think what it's showing is that he understands that nature has all these powers that can be harnessed. I think the important part of this section is actually how his father shows him that you can recreate this electricity.
That you can recreate something natural.
Yeah, you can recreate this natural phenomena and also harness this natural phenomena through using this kite and wire and string, which is what makes it really powerful as a scene. I think it's kind of his moment of realizing that he can take over that role of nature. You know, as a human being, he can sort of recreate this power that nature has. Or
I think also because the like power of the alchemists was almost like magical and untangible,
Right.
And now he sort of sees something very physical, tangible, powerful that he can actually do. It's like the sort of quote that comes up in like the college years section, where the professor he loves is talking about like the old natural philosophers or alchemists, and he's saying like they had these grand ideas, but like achieved nothing, whereas the modern scientists promise very little but like achieve wonders.
yeah, I think that's a really good parallel because both of those sort of point to Frankenstein's ambition almost. Like, it's about what he can conceptualize rather than what the actual means of doing it is, I think. It's he has this idea. Like, it's not what he really does as that's kind of subversive and questionable. It's actually just having that idea is the most subversive thing that he can have. Like, having the concept of I can be God, I can create life. That's what's most important. I don't think there's a reason that the actual animation isn't really described, and I think it's because that doesn't matter so much as just having the sort of power to do it, no matter how that works, you know?
And I think another reason why a lot of adaptations really focalize on this idea of electricity is because, like, at the time Mary was writing this, there were a lot of real life experimentations with kind of using electricity to make, dead body parts like twitch.
Yeah.
And so people have and that may well have been an inspiration, but that doesn't remove from the fact that that's not what's described in the novel.
No. Yeah, like nothing is really described, so we can't actually know.
Yeah, it's why that scene in the Elle Fanning biopic of Mary Shelley, where they're watching an event of electricity being used to make a body part move, and it's played with real significance, and I'm like, fuck off. It's not how the story goes.
Yeah.
Granted, most of that movie had me, fuck off. It's not how the story goes.
But I mean, I think you can see where it comes from, and it's not baseless. I think if you wanted to make a reading, it's there's enough evidence in the text that you can support that the creature was brought to life through electricity.
And that it was stitched together of body parts,
yeah,
which is also not what's described in the text.
Well, yes. I think the stitched together from body parts is more substantiated in the text.
It's a bit more, but it still annoys me that it doesn't annoy me that is. It doesn't annoy me that is an interpretation. I think it's a valid interpretation. It annoys me that that's the only interpretation.
Right.
And that it's... Or not even that. What really annoys me is that interpretation is considered valid and canon, where it's not. It's just an interpretation. It's not what's explicitly written in the text. That's what kind of bugs me. It bugs me when actual, literary figures are describing the novel and they're like, yes, and it's stitched together body parts. And I'm like, she never describes that in the novel. That is an interpretation. And we will talk about this more when we get to the college years / bringing the creature to life segment of this show.
Yes.
There will be rage.
I can tell.
Mostly by me. I don't think this is a part that annoys Nancy too much.
No, I don't really care. I'd like to see some different interpretations, but ultimately, the creature is so beautiful, I don't mind.
You're beautiful in every single way. Whether you're Boris Karloff or... Oh, who played you in the Kenneth Branagh one? All right, listeners, after much deliberation, we decided to incorporate the first, 2 pages of chapter 2 into the childhood years, because it's kind of getting into the college years, but it's the end of his childhood, and I distinguish this book into the sections as I choose to.
Well, I mean, it's very...
Authorial intent be damned.
It's very kind of typical of like a Bildungsroman or something, that the death of the parent is kind of symbolic of the end of childhood. And that's what happens when, just before Victor goes off to college.
Because his dad is finally like, well, you should probably make friends outside of the family.
Yeah, Victor is very much a family man, shall we say. So basically, Elizabeth catches scarlet fever, and because
Pesky women and their illnesses.
and because Caroline really wants to care for Elizabeth, she goes in and tends to Elizabeth before she's fully recovered.
Like, she's better, but all the servants or the people tending on her have been just stay away. And she's like, no, I must look after my favourite. No offence, boys.
And so basically she also contracts scarlet fever, and then she takes it harder than Elizabeth, and she dies.
Making it the second mother Elizabeth has killed. If she died. If the first one died in childbirth. I don't know if it actually said that, or I'm just making an assumption. But it draws an interesting parallel between Mary and Elizabeth, and I kind of like that.
Yeah, do you think maybe Mary wished her stepmom would contract scarlet fever and die?
I think it's more... I don't know, if you're thinking it... If you're considering the idea that maybe Mary as a person felt guilt over her mother's passing by bringing her into the world, which again we aren't to know whether that's true or not, but I think empathically we can imagine that's possible.
Yeah.
And so I think it is significant, it's possibly significant that Caroline Mama Frankenstein dies because she just loves her daughter so much and wants to tend her and make sure she's okay. So yeah, there could be something there, or again, it could just be plot device. But yeah, anyhow. So yeah, Mama Frankenstein dies and everyone's sad.
Yep.
Particularly Elizabeth, who killed her. Yeah.
I think Caroline's last words are also very interesting. She says, "Alas, I regret that I'm taken from you, and happy and beloved as I have been, is it not hard to quit you all? But these are not thoughts befitting me. I will endeavour to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge a hope of meeting you in another world." Right, so you see kind of the self-sacrifice kind of continuing even right till the end of Caroline's life. And it's really interesting that she says, "I will resign myself cheerfully to death." I find that a little bit odd.
I think it's just, it is that self-sacrificing kind of, I go calmly to death so not to distress everyone. But, I don't know, it is interesting.
I find it sort of an echo of Victor's own death at the end, where he kind of says, "I also resign myself to death." But it's kind of the opposite of cheerful, as he has not been happy and beloved. So you kind of have this sort of contrast there. But I also think it's very interesting that Victor tries to overcome life and death when all his experiences with death, well, this one experience with death, is actually quite not traumatic. It's very peaceful. It's kind of completely the opposite of what you would expect, right? Caroline very happy, or not happy. Like Caroline's very
She's resigned to
Yeah.
death. I think that's just the way. She's just like sort of calmly taking
She's
it because I think she's
accepting
just
it.
accepted it.
Right. So it's interesting to contrast her acceptance compared to Victor's obvious, I don't know, lack of acceptance. Like, he says that here, that grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity. So he kind of thinks that, you know, it's normal, like, people will die. And then he kind of flips that completely around after he's at Ingolstadt. So I kind of wonder what happens there. You know, what makes him go from experiencing this sort of peaceful death to seeing death as sort of something to be overcome and
Well, maybe there is, you know, for such a young person, a horror in seeing someone who they love so much just accept death, accept this the end of being, which I think as a child, it's hard to conceive of death. Mm-hmm. And so it's probably in a way just as traumatizing to see someone cheerfully resign themselves to like just leaving him. And so I think maybe what drives him is his belief that we shouldn't just accept that. We should try to fight against it. Because maybe it is like the lack of fight. I mean, but yeah, it's, you know, her death is described in the way like his entire childhood is described. This very sort of peaceful, harmonious, like emotive, but ultimately like beautiful scene. Maybe we should wrap it up there and then we'll talk about the college years in the college years episode.
that sounds good. So we had to end on a bit of a downer where Caroline dies.
Mama Frankie is dead.
But I guess we got through one chapter and a little bit, so let's count that as a success.
Yay! Let's sign off.
Let's sign off. Blah, blah, blah.
Come find us on the social media we'll hopefully have set up by this episode.
So we have a email address now called
Yay!
the Postmodern Prometheus podcast at gmail.com. It's a bit of a mouthful, but you can email
Everything
us
else was taken.
You can email us there. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. And please send us any suggestions of adaptations of Frankenstein you'd like us to get around to. Although at this pace, I think that will be in about 2 years. So.
Oh, look, you probably. Well, look, we will be like talking about various adaptations as we go through this because it's kind of hard not to. Like, I really struggled not to just side mention the Kenneth Branagh one about how they did the lightning of the tree scene, in which it... Because they do that really interesting. The way they do it is in that one, and it's super relevant because it's about the childhood years, but Caroline in this version dies in childbirth, giving birth to baby William. And
William, he ruins everything.
He really does. So she's in sort of labour and I think it's been going on a while because like Victor and Elizabeth are getting a bit worried and it's storming outside because of course it is, because symbolism. And outside as the storm is happening and it keeps cutting back to Caroline and it's like Victor's dad in the Kenneth Branagh one is also a surgeon, which I don't know is just a thing. And so he's like he's delivering the baby himself and there's complications and you keep cutting back and forth and you know bad things are going to happen because things have been so happy thus far. And it cuts back to Frankenstein, Victor and Elizabeth, and in the background outside, a lightning bolt destroys the tree. And like that's the thing. They sort of look at it and then they sort of like run upstairs because the dad comes down and he's covered in blood, and then they like go in and like the poor Caroline is just like covered in blood. Like that is a very gruesome and probably traumatizing way to experience death for the first time, unlike the novel. But yeah, no, it was really interesting because in that one, that bit with the tree, it was almost like this happened in the novel. It was either that or just symbolism of death of childhood and innocence. I don't know.
So much angst. I really like your point that, maybe it's the fact that Caroline gives up so easily. That's what motivates Victor then to really question the boundaries of life and death, kind of.
And even if that's not the case, I think that would be an interesting point for adaptation or interpretation. If there are anyone listening who is interested in text and would like to make their own version of it. Because, we really like Frankenstein adaptations and we would like to see more versatility in them. So hopefully we can help inspire ideas. Since we have none of our own.
I mean, I think, like a lot of adaptations of Frankenstein and his mother's death tend to frame her death as sort of very traumatic in a way. And I think that's just quite interesting that it's not portrayed that way. Like, it's interesting that people who are adapting Frankenstein think that the death must be traumatic in a sort of like in a very stereotypical way.
Yeah.
Whereas, like we talked about, maybe it's not that itself. It's maybe just the factor of death.
And I think for such a young person, like he's 17 when this happens, I think.
Yep.
And like, again, like it is his mother and he was growing up in a very like close-knit, tight-knit, like secluded, secluded isn't the word I want, but it's somewhere between secluded and isolated, but it's just they were very like a tight-knit family with like Henry.
Yeah, I think it must have a huge impact on you. I mean, just normally, but he doesn't have a lot of other people around him, so it would make it even more important, I think, that she dies. But yeah.
And he like goes away to college like right after, like quite soon afterwards.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, I think the fact that he goes away and it's so fresh on his mind, maybe, like, he doesn't really get time to process or, I don't know, like, come to terms with his grief with his other family. I think that's actually a really interesting point, that he's kind of missing that step where he's coming to terms with her death with the other members of his family so that they're mourning together. It's more like, oh, she died. Oh no, I'm off to college now. And yeah, and I get to stew over this death kind of in isolation. Maybe that's what, psychologically, like, would affect him a lot.
Yeah, this novel really is like a warning against the dangers of isolation and seclusion.
Yeah.
Both in like raising children and just like in of the self.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, it's so idyllic and so secluded and happy, and yet it's not seen as good. Like, it's not...
I think because it's a part of, like, he's not prepared for death when it comes. Because he's never had to deal with any other, like, really significant adversary or drama in his life. Like, they never quarreled. They were allowed to study what they wanted. They were never, like, pressured into things. They never really had to work. And then when Victor does find something he's good at, he's a kind of a prodigy at it. So he never really has to... he never really has to struggle as a child.
Yeah.
And
you know what this reminds me of? Sorry to interrupt you.
You love interrupting me.
Yeah,
But
I
go
do.
on.
But I was watching this show called Child Genius on SBS. It's like this like reality kids quiz show. And some of the kids,
Sounds like something you'd watch.
well, some of the kids on that show, I just feel like they're quite ill equipped for life. And it just reminds me a lot of Victor. And yeah. Yeah, like when you're like so smart intellectually, but in a lot of ways socially and
Yeah.
emotionally, you're not equipped for what your intellect can tell you about the world. Like, I think in some ways Victor is very juvenile, like in his emotional development.
Yeah.
Like, for sure, he never developed any sort of sexual interest, which, as I say, it's not necessary, but like it is something that you usually associate with sort of growing up and maturing emotionally, but he never really has that. And in a lot of other ways, he's like socially quite incompetent.
Well, yeah, you just never really see him socializing with peers. Like that's probably a good segue to sort of like end on and then discuss in the college years. Because the college years are really just about the experiments and the learning. There's not a lot of
Right, he never has any
fun
friends.
college years.
Yeah,
That
like
he describes anyway.
he doesn't go to any parties, he doesn't do any drugs. He's just like
I think like if he made any friends at college, they didn't make the cut of like the story.
they weren't important enough. Yeah, it's so interesting that he never develops any emotional connections in his adulthood, except for Walton, arguably. But like, he's like so close to his family and his friends
Yeah.
from childhood, and he never really like expands his social awareness. That's really interesting. I never actually thought about that, but yeah, he's a little bit.
And here's where, well, we've kind of already did our outro and kept going, so this is where I'm gonna bring in the like outro music. So I want to say bye, Nancy. The music's getting louder. Say bye, Nancy.
I would
We
like to
can't hear
thank
you.
God and my
And they can't hear
manager.
anymore, and we're done. I wonder if Walton went home and he like turned Frankenstein this like into like a novel, got it like published like in story, and then so someone like Victor's college buddies like picked it up and they're like, that fucking dick, he never even mentioned us. We had wild times with that guy. We didn't make the cut of his story.
That
He mentioned how his mum and dad met, but he doesn't mention the time we got